Hi, you guys. Hope you're doing well today. We're going to keep going. I realize it's technically a Saturday if you've been watching all these videos in a row, but I feel like 2 days is kind of too long to go without hearing our book, Tuesdays with Morrie, right? So we're going to read on a Saturday. And first, we'll take a look at a poem. So I hope everyone is doing well, and we'll go right to our poem for today. So this one is a classic Emily Dickinson. Hope is the thing with feathers. And it's very possible that you've seen this poem at some point in middle school or in high school. A lot of Emily Dickinson's poems don't have titles. Most of them don't. They're just either the first line, or you can see this one's numbered. She didn't publish many of her poems while she was alive, and after she died, they found like 1,500 poems like stuffed in this dresser, and that's where we get a lot of them now. So this is, like I said, one of the better known ones. Hope is the thing with feathers. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. And sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm that could abash the little bird that kept so many warm. I've heard it in the chillest land and on the strangest sea, yet never in extremity it asked a crumb of me. So this poem is, it's all about personification, right? Sort of, and it uses the metaphor of hope as a bird. So technically it's not personification because it's not a person, but it is taking this abstract concept of hope and making it into a bird that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words. That's a really interesting line because I feel like she's alluding to this music that goes beyond language, and it's something sort of beyond words. It can't be expressed in words. It's sort of deeper even than that. So it's kind of this primal thing that exists in the world, and it never stops. So it's always there. And then the second stanza, sweetest in the gale. Gale, of course, is wind, right? So in the storm and in the wind, when you hear that tune from this little bird of hope, it's sweet because you're in it. You're in the middle of the storm. You're suffering, right? But then you hear this little voice, this little songbird of hope. And she says it must be a pretty bad storm that could abash the little bird. At the same time, though, in stanza 1, she does say it never stops. So I feel like it's always there, even in the toughest times, even if you think you can't hear it. And then stanza 3, she says she's heard it in the coldest land and the strangest sea. So in all sorts of extreme situations, she's been able to access this feeling, this song of hope. And then the last lines, yet never in extremity it asked a crumb of me. So hope is something that we always have access to, and we don't have to pay for it. We don't have to do anything for it. It's just always there. I feel like that echoes a lot of what we've seen in the poems from this week and last week. This idea that if we can tap into this quietness or this sense of peace, or in this poem, this sense of hope, it's always there for us. We just have to kind of quiet ourselves and allow ourselves to feel it. So hope is what we need now, definitely. Hope. Yep, we're in the middle of it, and we just have to hang on till the end, till the storm passes over. But we do always have access to these feelings that are positive and primal. They're beyond language. They're kind of with us. It's part of being human that we have hope and peace and things like that. All right, let's go back to Morrie. Here we are back with Morrie. So we're making our way through the second half of the book. Okay, question, I say to Morrie. His bony fingers hold his glasses across his chest, which rises and falls with each labored breath. What's the question? He says. Remember the book of Job from the Bible? Right. Job is a good man, but God makes him suffer to test his faith. I remember. Takes away everything he has, his house, his money, his family, his health. Makes him sick to test his faith. Right, to test his faith. So I'm wondering, what are you wondering? What did you think about that? Morrie coughs violently. His hands quiver as he drops them by his side. I think, he says, smiling, God overdid it. The 11th Tuesday, we talk about our culture. Hit him harder. I slapped Morrie's back. Harder. I slapped him again. Near his shoulders. Now down lower. Morrie, dressed in pajama bottoms, lay in bed on his side, his head flush against the pillow, his mouth open. The physical therapist was showing me how to bang loose the poison in his lungs, which he needed done regularly now to keep it from solidifying, to keep him breathing. I always knew you wanted to hit me, Morrie gasped. Yeah, I joked as I rapped my fist against the alabaster skin of his back. This is for that B you gave me sophomore year. Whack! We all laughed, a nervous laughter that comes when the devil is within earshot. It would have been cute, this little scene, were it not what we all knew it was, the final calisthenics before death. Morrie's disease was now dangerously close to his surrender spot, his lungs. He had been predicting he would die from choking, and I could not imagine a more terrible way to go. Sometimes he would close his eyes and try to draw the air up into his mouth and nostrils, and it seemed as if he were trying to lift an anchor. Outside, it was jacket weather, early October, the leaves clumped in piles on the lawns around West Newton. Morrie's physical therapist had come earlier in the day, and I usually excused myself when nurses or specialists had business with him. But as the weeks passed and our time ran down, I was increasingly less self-conscious about the physical embarrassment. I wanted to be there. I wanted to observe everything. This was not like me, but then neither were a lot of things that had happened in these last few months in Morrie's house. So I watched the therapist work on Morrie in the bed, pounding the back of his ribs, asking if he could feel the congestion loosening within him. And when she took a break, she asked if I wanted to try it. I said yes. Morrie, his face on the pillow, gave a little smile. Not too hard, he said. I'm an old man. I drummed on his back and sides, moving around as she instructed. I hated the idea of Morrie's lying in bed under any circumstances. His last aphorism, when you're in bed, you're dead, rang in my ears. And curled on his side, he was so small, so withered, it was more a boy's body than a man's. I saw the paleness of his skin, the stray white hairs, the way his arms hung limp and helpless. I thought about how much time we spend trying to shape our bodies, lifting weights, crunching sit-ups, and in the end, nature takes it away from us anyhow. Beneath my fingers, I felt the loose flesh around Morrie's bones, and I thumped him hard, as instructed. The truth is, I was pounding on his back when I wanted to be hitting the walls. Mitch, Morrie gasped. his voice jumpy as a jackhammer as I pounded on him. Uh-huh. When did I give you a B? Morrie believed in the inherent good of people, but he also saw what they could become. People are only mean when they're threatened, he said later that day. And that's what our culture does. That's what our economy does. Even people who have jobs in our economy are threatened because they worry about losing them. And when you get threatened, you start looking out only for yourself. You start making money a god. It is all part of this culture. He exhaled, which is why I don't buy into it. I nodded at him and squeezed his hand. We held hands regularly now. This was another change for me. Things that would have made me embarrassed or squeamish were now routinely handled. The catheter bag, connected to the tube inside him and filled with greenish waste fluid, lay by my foot near the leg of his chair. A few months earlier, it might have disgusted me. It was inconsequential now. So was the smell of the room after Morrie had used the commode. He did not have the luxury of moving from place to place, of closing a bathroom door behind him, spraying some air freshener when he left. There was his bed, there was his chair, and that was his life. If my life were squeezed into such a thimble, I doubt I could make it smell any better. Here's what I mean by building your own little subculture, Morrie said. I don't mean you disregard every rule of your community. I don't go around naked, for example. I don't run through red lights. The little things I can obey, but the big things, how we think, what we value, those you must choose yourself. You can't let anyone or any society determine those for you. Take my condition, the things I am supposed to be embarrassed about now, not being able to walk, not being able to wipe my ass, waking up some mornings wanting to cry. There is nothing innately embarrassing or shaming about them. It's the same for women not being thin enough or men not being rich enough. It's just what our culture would have you believe. Don't believe it. I asked Morrie why he hadn't moved somewhere else when he was younger. Where? I don't know. South America, New Guinea, someplace not as selfish as America. Every society has its own problems, Morrie said, lifting his eyebrows, the closest he could come to a shrug. The way to do it, I think, isn't to run away. You have to work at creating your own culture. Look, no matter where you live, the biggest defect we human beings have is our short-sightedness. We don't see what we could be. We should be looking at our potential, stretching ourselves into everything we can become. But if you're surrounded by people who say, I want mine now, you end up with a few people with everything and a military to keep the poor ones from rising up and stealing it. Morrie looked over my shoulder to the far window. Sometimes you could hear a passing truck or a whip of the wind. He gazed for a moment at his neighbors' houses, then continued. The problem, Mitch, is that we don't believe we are as much alike as we are. Whites and blacks, Catholics and Protestants, men and women. If we saw each other as more alike, we might be very eager to join in one big human family in this world and to care about that family the way we care about our own. But believe me, when you are dying, you see it as true. We all have the same beginning, birth, and we all have the same end, death. So how different can we be? Invest in the human family. Invest in people. Build a little community of those you love and who love you. He squeezed my hand gently. I squeezed back harder. And like that carnival contest where you bang a hammer and watch the disc rise up the pole, I could almost see my body heat rise up Morrie's chest and neck into his cheeks and eyes. He smiled. In the beginning of life, when we are infants, we need others to survive, right? And at the end of life, when you get like me, you need others to survive, right? His voice dropped to a whisper. But here's the secret. In between, we need others as well. Later that afternoon, Connie and I went into the bedroom to watch the O.J. Simpson verdict. It was a tense scene as the principals all turned to face the jury. Simpson, in his blue suit, surrounded by his small army of lawyers, the prosecutors who wanted him behind bars just a few feet away. When the foreman read the verdict, not guilty, Connie shrieked, "Oh my God!" We watched as Simpson hugged his lawyers. We listened as the commentators tried to explain what it all meant. We saw crowds of blacks celebrating in the streets outside the courthouse and crowds of whites sitting stunned inside restaurants. The decision was being hailed as momentous, even though murders take place every day. Connie went out in the hall. She had seen enough. I heard the door to Morrie's study close. I stared at the TV set. Everyone in the world is watching this thing, I told myself. Then, from the other room, I heard the ruffling of Morrie's being lifted from his chair, and I smiled. As the trial of the century reached its dramatic conclusion, my old professor was sitting on the toilet. It is 1979, a basketball game in the Brandeis gym. The team is doing well, and the student section begins a chant. "We're number one! We're number one!" Morrie is sitting nearby. He is puzzled by the cheer. At one point, in the midst of "We're number one," he rises and yells, "What's wrong with being number two?" The students look at him. They stop chanting. He sits down, smiling and triumphant. The Audiovisual, Part 3. The Nightline crew came back for its third and final visit. The whole tenor of the thing was different now, less like an interview, more like a sad farewell. Ted Koppel had called several times before coming up, and he had asked Morrie, "Do you think you can handle it?" Morrie wasn't sure he could. "I'm tired all the time now, Ted, and I'm choking a lot. If I can't say something, will you say it for me?" Koppel said sure. And then the normally stoic anchor added this, "If you don't want to do it, Morrie, it's okay. I'll come up and say goodbye anyhow." Later, Morrie would grin mischievously and say, "I'm getting to him." And he was. Koppel now referred to Morrie as a friend. My old professor had even coaxed compassion out of the television business. For the interview, which took place on a Friday afternoon, Morrie wore the same shirt he'd had on the day before. He'd changed shirts only every other day at this point, and this was not the other day, so why break routine? Unlike the previous two Koppel-Schwartz sessions, this one was conducted entirely within Morrie's study, where Morrie had become a prisoner of his chair. Koppel, who kissed my old professor when he first saw him, now had to squeeze in alongside the bookcase in order to be seen in the camera's lens. Before they started, Koppel asked about the disease's progression. "How bad is it, Morrie?" Morrie weakly lifted a hand halfway up his belly. This was as far as he could go. Koppel had his answer. The camera rolled the third and final interview. Koppel asked if Morrie was more afraid now that death was near. Morrie said no. To tell the truth, he was less afraid. He said he was letting go of some of the outside world, not having the newspaper read to him as much, not paying as much attention to mail. Instead, listening more to music and watching the leaves change color through his window. There were other people who suffered from ALS, Morrie knew, some of them famous, such as Stephen Hawking, the brilliant physicist and author of A Brief History of Time. He lived with a hole in his throat, spoke through a computer synthesizer, typed words by batting his eyes as a sensor picked up the movement. This was admirable, but it was not the way Morrie wanted to live. He told Koppel he knew when it would be time to say goodbye. For me, Ted, living means I can be responsive to the other person. It means I can show my emotions and my feelings, talk to them, feel with them. He exhaled. When that is gone, Morrie is gone. They talked like friends. As he had in the previous 2 interviews, Koppel asked about the old ass wipe test, hoping, perhaps, for a humorous response. But Morrie was too tired even to grin. He shook his head. When I sit on the commode, I can no longer sit up straight. I'm listing all the time, so they have to hold me. When I'm done, they have to wipe me. That is how far it's gotten. He told Koppel he wanted to die with serenity. He shared his latest aphorism. Don't let go too soon, but don't hang on too long. Koppel nodded painfully. Only 6 months had passed between the first Nightline show and this one, but Morrie Schwartz was clearly a collapsed form. He had decayed before a national TV audience, a mini-series of a death. But as his body rotted, his character shone even more brightly. Toward the end of the interview, the camera zoomed in on Morrie. Koppel was not even in the picture, only his voice was heard from outside it. And the anchor asked if my old professor had anything he wanted to say to the millions of people he had touched. Although he did not mean it this way, I could not help but think of a condemned man being asked for his final words. Be compassionate, Morrie whispered, and take responsibility for each other. If we only learned those lessons, the world would be so much better a place. He took a breath, then added his mantra, love each other or die. The interview was ended, but for some reason, the cameraman left the film rolling and a final scene was caught on tape. You did a good job, Koppel said. Morrie smiled weakly. I gave you what I had, he whispered. You always do. Ted, this disease is knocking at my spirit, but it will not get my spirit. It'll get my body. It will not get my spirit. Koppel was near tears. You done good. You think so? Morrie rolled his eyes toward the ceiling. I'm bargaining with him up there now. I'm asking him, do I get to be one of the angels? It was the first time Morrie admitted talking to God. That's a good place to stop, you guys. So have a good rest of the weekend, and I will see you on Monday. Make the best of the time. Take care of yourself. Make sure you're getting rest and fresh air and healthy food, and we'll pick up with our work on Monday. So have a good rest of the weekend. See you.